My son kicked me out of my own home because my daughter-in-law considered me an extra mouth to feed. But they had no idea that just a month later, I would buy the exact apartment building they lived in and triple their rent. When my entitled daughter-in-law realized that I was her new landlord, she screamed hysterically, "You can't do this! I am so glad to have you here." Before I reveal exactly how I turned my heartbreak into the ultimate revenge, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling me which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Evelyn. I'm 62 years old, and I never thought my own flesh and blood would betray me in the most cruel way possible. Until that Tuesday in October, I believed I had raised a good man. Marcus had been my only son, my pride and joy, the boy I raised alone after his father died when he was barely 12 years old. I worked double shifts as a secretary for years to give him a college education so he could have everything I never could. But that day, while making breakfast in the kitchen of the house where I had lived for 35 years, I heard angry voices coming from the master bedroom. It wasn't the first time I had heard Marcus and Ashley arguing, but this time, something in her tone made my blood run cold. "I can't take this situation anymore, Marcus," Ashley was saying, with that high-pitched voice she used when she wanted to get her way. "Your mother is a burden. An extra mouth to feed, utilities to pay, space being taken up. We need privacy. We need our own home. But she's my mother, Ashley," Marcus replied, though his voice sounded weak, lacking conviction. "So what? She's already lived her life. We are just starting ours. Besides, it's not like she's homeless. She has her pension. She can rent a little apartment somewhere." My hands trembled as I held my coffee mug. Ashley had come into our lives 2 years ago. A 35-year-old woman with a perfect smile and always impeccable nails. From day one, I noticed how she looked at me, as if I were an old piece of furniture cluttering her new decor. But Marcus was in love, blinded by her superficial charms. "I don't know, honey. It would feel like I'm abandoning her," Marcus muttered. "Abandoning? Marcus, you are 40 years old. It's time for you to be an independent man. Look at our friends. They all live alone with their partners. We are the only ones who still live with a mother-in-law." The word mother-in-law sounded like poison in her mouth. I had tried to be good to her. I had cooked her favorite meals, given her space in my own home, even pretended it didn't bother me when she redecorated entire rooms without consulting me, all out of love for my son. "Besides," Ashley continued, "think about it economically. The money we spend on her could be saved for our future, for when we have kids. Do you really want our children growing up thinking it's normal to keep elderly parents at home?" Those words were like stab wounds. Elderly parents. As if I were a burden, a nuisance, something to be disposed of. I had raised Marcus with unconditional love. I had sacrificed my own dreams, my own chances to rebuild my life after becoming a widow, and now I had become a problem to solve. I heard Marcus's footsteps approaching the kitchen. I quickly focused on my breakfast, pretending I hadn't heard anything. When he walked in, his face was tense. He avoided my gaze. "Mom," he started. His voice sounded strange, forced. "We need to talk." My heart sank, but I kept my composure. "Of course, son. What's wrong?" He sat across from me, his restless hands playing with the edge of the tablecloth. "It's about the living situation." "What situation?" I asked, even though I already knew where the conversation was heading. "Mom, Ashley and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if you had your own place." The silence stretched between us like an abyss. I could see Ashley standing in the doorway, watching, waiting for my reaction. "My own place," I repeated slowly. "Yeah, something small, comfortable. You have your pension, and we could help you out for the first few months." "Are you kicking me out of my house, Marcus?" "It's not your house, Mom," Ashley intervened, stepping fully into the kitchen. "It's our house. Marcus and I pay the mortgage now." It was true. 2 years ago, when Marcus married Ashley, they had insisted on refinancing the house and putting everything in their names. They said it was for tax purposes, for future inheritance. Trusting my son, I had signed the papers. Now I realized how naive I had been. "This is the house where I raised my son," I said. my voice breaking slightly. Where I lived with your father. And now it's time to make new memories, Ashley retorted coldly. Look, Evelyn, it's not personal. It's just that we need our space. Marcus still wouldn't look me in the eye. My own son, the boy I had comforted through nightmares, whom I had rushed to the hospital when he broke his arm, for whom I had cheered at every graduation, couldn't even face what he was doing to me. And what if I don't want to leave? I asked, though I already knew it was a losing battle. Ashley smiled, but it was a cold, calculated smile. Well, then we would have to explore other legal options, but I'm sure we don't want it to come to that, right? The threat was clear. I stood up from the table, feeling as if the floor were shifting beneath my feet. I understand, I simply said. Over the next 2 hours, I packed my life into cardboard boxes. Ashley had the audacity to help me by throwing away things she deemed unnecessary without even asking. Pictures of my husband, keepsakes from Marcus's childhood objects that held no value to her, but to me, they were irreplaceable treasures. When the taxi arrived to take me to a cheap hotel downtown, a few neighbors came out to watch. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived next door for 20 years, walked over with tears in her eyes. Evelyn, what is going on? I couldn't answer. The humiliation was too deep. Marcus carried my bags to the taxi without saying a word, like a stranger fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. Before getting into the car, I turned to him one last time. Is this really what you want, son? For a moment, a very brief moment, I saw the little boy he used to be in his eyes. But Ashley appeared at his side, placed her hand on his arm, and his expression hardened once more. It's what's best for everyone, Mom. As the taxi pulled away, I looked out the back window at the house that had been my home for more than 3 decades. Ashley was already closing the front door, as if trying to erase any trace of my existence as quickly as possible. That night, alone in a hotel room that smelled of disinfectant and sadness, I cried like I hadn't cried since my husband's death. But through the tears, something else began to grow in my chest. It wasn't just pain. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something colder, something more determined. It was the awakening of a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. The first few days at the hotel were hell. I woke up every morning expecting to hear the familiar sounds of my old house. The leaky kitchen faucet, the creak of the floorboards when Marcus came down for breakfast, even Ashley's heels echoing through the hallways. Instead, there was only the constant hum of traffic and unfamiliar voices filtering through the thin walls. The room was small and depressing. A twin bed with a worn-out bedspread, a tiny television that barely worked, and a window overlooking an alley filled with dumpsters. Every night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had gotten to this point, at what moment I had lost control of my own life. On the 3rd day, while organizing my few belongings, I found a box I didn't remember packing. Inside were my husband's important documents, investment certificates, insurance policies, bank papers I hadn't looked at in years. Robert had always managed the family finances, and after his death, I had simply lived off my pension without paying much attention to the rest. That afternoon, I walked to the nearest public library. I didn't own a computer and needed internet access to check the bank accounts Robert had left behind. My hands shook as I typed in the account numbers and passwords I found written in his familiar handwriting in an old notebook. What I discovered left me breathless. The savings account I thought was almost empty had $47,000. There was a certificate of deposit that had been gathering interest for 12 years, now valued at $89,000. But what really shocked me was discovering an investment account at a different bank, one Robert had opened shortly before he died, containing tech stock shares that were now worth over $230,000. My husband had been a forward-thinking man, but he had never told me the true magnitude of our savings. We had always lived modestly, him out of prudence, me out of habit, after years of scarcity in my youth. Now, sitting in front of a library computer, staring at figures that represented more money than I had seen in my entire life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Over the following week, I visited banks and financial advisor offices. One of them, a young man named David Miller, was particularly patient with me. He explained how investments worked, how I could generate passive income, and most importantly, how I could make my money work for me instead of just keeping it locked away. Mrs. Evelyn, he told me during our second meeting, With this amount of capital, you could live very comfortably for the rest of your life. You could even consider real estate investments. Real estate. The words echoed in my mind in a strange way. That night, in my hotel room, I started researching the local housing market. I learned about rentals, investment properties, and how landlords generated steady monthly income. It was then that I had an idea. The next day, I hired the services of a private investigator. She was a middle-aged woman named Sarah Hayes, who ran a small but efficient office downtown. I explained my situation without getting into too many emotional details, keeping it practical and straightforward. "I need you to investigate my son, Marcus, and his wife Ashley," I told her. "I want to know their real financial situation, their income, their expenses, any debt they might have." Sarah nodded professionally. "May I ask why you need this information?" "I'm considering an investment that might involve them," I half-lied. "I need to make sure it's a smart decision." 3 days later, Sarah called me in for a meeting. The results of her investigation were eye-opening. Marcus made a decent salary as a sales manager, but Ashley didn't work. Their monthly expenses were exorbitant. Expensive dinners, designer clothes, frequent vacations. They had racked up $28,000 in credit card debt and were behind on 2 mortgage payments for the house. "Their financial situation is precarious," Sarah explained. "They are living way beyond their means. The husband seems to be working overtime constantly just to maintain their lifestyle." That information hurt me in an unexpected way. Marcus was struggling financially, and instead of asking me for help, he had chosen to get rid of me like I was a burden. The irony was bitter. I had more money than he ever imagined, but he had preferred to follow the advice of a woman who was spending more than they could afford. That night, walking through the downtown streets, I passed by an apartment building that had a for sale sign. It was a modest 3-story building with 6 units. According to the sign, the asking price was $380,000. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. It was exactly the kind of property David, my financial advisor, had mentioned as a good starter investment. It would generate steady rental income, and its value would likely increase over time. But there was something else. Something that made my heart race as I looked at the building. It was located exactly in the neighborhood where Marcus and Ashley had been apartment hunting before they kicked me out. I knew this because I had overheard Ashley commenting about this charming area near downtown where they eventually wanted to move. That night, for the first time since I was thrown out, I smiled before falling asleep. The next day, I called David and told him I wanted to make an offer on the building. I also hired Sarah to look into something more specific. I wanted to know exactly which building Marcus and Ashley were currently living in, who the landlord was, and if that property was on the market or might be soon. As I walked back to the hotel after signing the preliminary paperwork for the purchase of the building, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about having a place to live. It was about taking back control of my life, about proving that Evelyn wasn't the fragile, dependent woman they thought she was. For the first time in 62 years, I was about to play the game by my own rules, and I intended to win. A week after buying my first apartment building, Sarah called me with news that made my pulse race. I was sitting at the little coffee shop where we usually met, a discreet place where we could talk without being interrupted. "I have the information you requested regarding your son's current residence," Sarah said, opening a manila folder. "Marcus and Ashley live in the Maple Gardens building, a luxury apartment complex on the north side. They pay $2,800 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. $2,800 a month. With their debts and Marcus's salary, that represented almost 60% of their income. No wonder they were falling behind on other payments." "And the landlord?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Sarah smiled slightly. "Here is where it gets interesting. The building belongs to a 74-year-old man named Richard Spaulding. According to my sources, he is considering selling. His wife passed away last year, and he wants to move to Florida to be closer to his kids." My heart started beating faster. "Is it officially on the market?" "Not yet, but my real estate contact says he'll probably list it in the coming weeks. It's a profitable building, 12 units, well-maintained. The estimated price would be around $2 million. $2 million. It was more than I had readily available, but David had already explained to me how commercial real estate loans worked. With my spotless credit history and the cash I had for a down payment, it would be entirely possible. Is there anything else? Sarah continued, lowering her voice. I managed to get copies of your son and daughter-in-law's credit reports. The situation is worse than we initially thought. She slid several documents across the table. As I reviewed them, I felt a mix of sadness and satisfaction. Marcus had 4 maxed-out credit cards, a personal loan he had taken out to pay for Ashley's engagement ring, and he was considering picking up a second weekend job to keep up with their expenses. Ashley has a rather particular history, Sarah added. Before marrying your son, she had racked up $15,000 in credit card debt. Marcus paid off those debts as a wedding gift, but she went right back to spending and now has another $12,000 in new debts. The irony was crushing. While Ashley called me a financial burden, she herself had cost Marcus over $27,000 in debt in just 2 years of marriage. Is there more? I asked. Sarah nodded. Your daughter-in-law has been pressuring Marcus to take out a home equity loan on the house that used to be yours. She wants to remodel the kitchen and add a pool. According to my sources, Marcus is pushing back because they already refinanced the house once and the payments are high. That piece of information hit me like a punch to the gut. The house that had been my home, where I had raised my son, where I had lived my best years with Robert. Now it was going to be mortgaged again to fund the whims of a woman who had tossed me out like garbage. How much is the house currently worth? I asked. Approximately $420,000. They owe $280,000 on the current mortgage. If they took out an additional loan, they'd be risking foreclosure if they can't make the payments. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. The numbers kept spinning in my head, but they weren't just numbers. Every debt, every irresponsible expense, every reckless financial decision represented a choice Marcus had made. He had chosen to please a woman who was driving him to financial ruin instead of valuing the mother who had sacrificed everything for him. The next day, I called David to discuss the possibility of buying the Maple Gardens building. His response was cautious but optimistic. It's a solid investment, Mrs. Evelyn, he told me during our meeting. The building has a great location, stable tenants, and the price seems reasonable for the current market. We could structure a loan covering 70% of the purchase price using your existing assets as collateral. And the current tenants? I asked. Would I have the right to adjust the rents? David checked his notes. Lease agreements in Texas allow for reasonable rent increases upon renewal, provided proper notice is given. If the current rents are below market value, you would have every right to adjust them accordingly. That was exactly the information I needed. That afternoon, I reached out directly to Richard Spaulding. He was an older man with a tired voice, clearly eager to close this chapter of his life and move to Florida. I have been thinking about selling, he confirmed over the phone. My wife always handled the day-to-day details of the building, and I just don't have the energy to keep up with it anymore. I would be interested in a private sale, I suggested. We could avoid real estate agent fees. We agreed to meet the next day. Richard turned out to be exactly what I had expected, a lonely widower looking for a quick, uncomplicated transaction. The building was in excellent condition, and the financial books showed it was highly profitable. There is something you should know, he told me as we toured the property. Some of the rents are significantly below market value. My wife was too kind. She never wanted to raise prices. A new owner could easily justify substantial increases. I reviewed the leases that very afternoon. Marcus and Ashley were paying $2,800 for an apartment that could easily rent for $4,200, according to current market rates. Other tenants also had below-market rents. A week later, I signed the purchase papers. I was officially the new owner of the building where Marcus and Ashley lived. The irony of the situation was exquisite. The woman they had deemed a financial nuisance now controlled their housing. That night, I celebrated alone in my hotel room with a cheap glass of wine. For the first time in months, I felt powerful. I hadn't acted out of impulse or emotion. I had planned every move carefully, using the same meticulous determination I had employed to raise Marcus when he was a boy. But this was different. This time, the fruits of my hard work would belong to me. Sarah had given me a copy of all the building's lease agreements. Marcus and Ashley's lease expired in 6 weeks. Under Texas law, I could raise the rent with a 30-day written notice as long as the increase was reasonable by market standards. 30 days. That was the time I had to decide exactly how I wanted to proceed. While reviewing the legal documents, I found something interesting in Marcus's lease. There was a clause allowing immediate termination of the contract if the tenant provided false information on their original application. Curious, I pulled up the application they had filled out 2 years prior. In the household income section, Marcus had reported an annual salary of $75,000. According to Sarah's investigation, his actual salary was $52,000. Under the liabilities section, he had checked none, when he clearly carried significant debt at the time. Falsifying information on a rental application was grounds for immediate eviction, but that would be too easy, too fast. I wanted them to feel the pressure gradually, to truly understand the consequences of their actions. I wanted Ashley, who had called me an extra mouth to feed, to experience what it really meant to struggle financially. I filed all the documents away in a new folder. On the cover, I wrote in clear handwriting, "Recovery Plan." It was time they learned that Evelyn wasn't the victim they thought she was. 2 weeks after becoming the owner of Maple Gardens, I hired a property management company called Summit Property Management. I didn't want to handle tenant interactions directly, at least not yet. It was better to keep my identity a secret while I set up my next move. The manager, an efficient woman named Patricia Collins, met with me at my new apartment. Yes, I had decided to move into one of the vacant units in my first building. It was a modest 1-bedroom apartment, but it was comfortable, and it gave me the freedom to finally leave the depressing hotel where I had been staying. "Mrs. Evelyn," Patricia said as we went over the tenant files, "this building has great income potential. Several of the rents are well below market value. With the proper adjustments, we could increase monthly revenue by 40%. What kind of timeline would you recommend?" I asked, keeping my tone strictly professional. "Well, legally we can raise rents to market value when the leases are up for renewal. For current tenants, I would recommend gradual increases to maintain stability. However, there are a few cases where the hikes could be more substantial." Patricia pointed to Marcus and Ashley's file. This unit, for example. It's a 2-bedroom apartment with a view, premium location, and they're only paying $2,800. Current market rate for a similar unit would be between $4,200 and $4,500. "What would be the maximum legal increase?" I asked. "In Texas, there is no specific cap on rent increases, provided proper notice is given and the hike is justifiable by market conditions. Since their lease expires in 4 weeks, we could issue a notice increasing their rent to $4,200, which would be entirely within legal parameters. 4,200美元. That would be a $1,400 monthly increase. Given Marcus and Ashley's financial reality, it would be completely impossible for them to pay it. They would have to move. Let's proceed with that, I told Patricia. Prepare the rent increase notices for all tenants whose leases expire next month. Use current market rates as your baseline. Patricia nodded and took notes. Are there any special considerations I should keep in mind? Just make sure all procedures are completely legal and thoroughly documented. I want everything handled entirely by the book. That afternoon, while Patricia prepared the paperwork, I drove over to my old neighborhood. I hadn't been back since the day they kicked me out, and I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and fierce determination as I cruised down the familiar streets. The house looked different. Ashley had changed the front door color from a deep blue to a bright red. She had added potted plants I didn't recognize and hung a decorative Home Sweet Home sign near the entrance. Every change felt like a slap in the face, a deliberate attempt to erase any trace of my prior existence. I parked at the end of the street and watched for a while. I saw Ashley step out of the house dressed in expensive clothes, getting into a brand new BMW they definitely didn't own when I lived there. Obviously, they had financed the car, adding another heavy financial burden to their already precarious situation. My phone rang. It was Sarah. "I have an update on your son's financial status," she said. Marcus just picked up a second job working weekends at an electronics store. Apparently, Ashley told him they needed more income to live comfortably. Live comfortably. Meanwhile, they had thrown out the woman who had supported them for years because she was a financial burden. Anything else? I asked. Yes. Ashley has been pushing hard to refinance the house again. She wants to use the cash out for a European vacation. Marcus has been resisting, but according to my sources, she's threatening to leave him if he doesn't agree. That information filled me with a cold fury. Ashley was willing to risk Marcus's financial stability for a vacation, while I had been kicked to the curb for being a supposed economic drain. That night, Patricia called me to confirm that the rent increase notices had been mailed out. All tenants will receive their certified letters tomorrow, she informed me. The increases will go into effect in 30 days. Perfect, I replied. And what about tenant reactions? Well, it's too early for reactions just yet, but based on my experience, some might request meetings to negotiate or ask for more time. How would you like me to handle those situations? With firmness, but professionalism. The prices are fair based on today's market. If someone can't afford it, they are free to look for alternatives better suited to their budget. The next day, from my apartment window, I could see the mail truck making its morning rounds. I knew that at that exact moment, Marcus and Ashley were receiving a letter that would change their lives. The letter was signed by Summit Property Management, with absolutely no indication that I was involved. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Patricia. Mrs. Evelyn, we've received our first pushback. A tenant from apartment 2B is extremely upset about the increase. She says it's impossible to pay that price and is demanding to speak directly with the landlord. Apartment 2B was where Marcus and Ashley lived. Did you speak with the primary leaseholder or someone else? I asked, with a woman. She said her name was Ashley and that this had to be a mistake. She was yelling something about tenant rights and legal threats. A cold smile spread across my face. Ashley, who had always solved all her problems through manipulation and tantrums, was now facing a situation she couldn't control with fake tears or empty threats. What did you tell her? I asked. I explained that the increase was based on a professional market evaluation and that it was completely legal. I told her that if she had specific questions, she could submit them in writing and we would review them. Did she mention anything about speaking with the owner? Yes, she was very insistent on that. I told her the owner prefers to handle all business through the management company, but that she could request an appointment if she had a special circumstance. Perfect. Ashley was desperate, and desperation would make her sloppy. If she requests a meeting, accept it, I told Patricia. But schedule the appointment for next week. I want them to have time for the reality of the situation to really sink in. That evening, I drove by my old neighborhood again. This time, I saw Marcus coming home from work. His shoulders slumped, his face displaying the heavy stress he was obviously carrying. Ashley rushed out of the house, gesturing wildly, clearly agitated. I could picture the conversation perfectly. She was demanding he do something about the rent hike. He was explaining there was absolutely nothing he could do. For the first time in months, I felt something akin to satisfaction. It wasn't exactly joy, it was something deeper. It was the feeling that, finally, consequences were catching up to the right people. Sarah called me that night with another update. Marcus has been making calls all afternoon looking for cheaper apartments. Apparently, there is nothing available in their price range in that part of the city, and Ashley, according to my sources, is furious. She's been blaming Marcus for not negotiating better when they signed the original lease. She also brought up the possibility of suing for an illegal rent increase. That legal threat made me chuckle. Patricia had documented everything meticulously. The increase was entirely justified and perfectly legal. Any competent lawyer would tell Ashley she had no case. That night, while making dinner in my new kitchen, I reflected on how fast circumstances had changed. A month ago, I was living in a cheap motel, feeling defeated and abandoned. Now, I controlled the fate of the two people who had betrayed me. But this was only the beginning. The rent increase was simply the first phase of my plan. I wanted them to feel the pressure, to understand what it meant to struggle financially. But I also wanted something else. I wanted the perfect moment to reveal exactly who their new landlord was, and that moment was approaching very quickly. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. at the Summit Property Management offices. Patricia had called me that morning to confirm that Ashley had insisted on coming alone, claiming Marcus was at work and that she could handle the situation much better than he could. Typical Ashley. She always believed her charm and manipulation could fix any problem. This time, she would be severely mistaken. I arrived at the office 30 minutes early, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit I had bought specifically for the occasion. I wanted to look professional, powerful, completely removed from the image of the older woman they had tossed out like garbage. Patricia had prepared a small but elegant conference room for me. On the table were copies of all the relevant documents: the original lease, the market evaluations, justifying the increase, and the building's financial ledgers. Everything was perfectly organized and airtight. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Patricia asked me one last time. "We could handle the meeting without you being present." "No," I answered firmly. "It's time she finds out exactly who she's dealing with." At 2 p.m. sharp, I heard voices in the reception area. The voice of Ashley was unmistakable. Loud, demanding, clearly trying to intimidate the receptionist. "I need to speak with someone who has actual authority," I heard her say. "I am not going to waste my time with low-level employees. This situation is completely unacceptable." Patricia stepped out to greet her, and a few minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching down the hallway. My heart was beating fast, but not from nerves. It was pure anticipation. The door opened and Patricia walked in first. "Mrs. Ashley, I'd like to introduce you to the owner of the Maple Gardens building." Ashley walked in right behind her, already talking before she even looked at where I was sitting. "Look, I need you to understand that this increase is completely irrational. My husband and I are model tenants. We have never had any issues, and this kind of sudden price hike is—" Her words cut off abruptly as her eyes met mine. I watched her go pale, her mouth open, but no sound coming out. For a full moment, nobody spoke. "Hello, Ashley," I said calmly, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Why don't you have a seat? We have a lot to talk about." Ashley stood frozen in the doorway, staring at me as if she had just seen a ghost. Patricia, who didn't know our personal history, looked a bit confused by the reaction. I, Ashley stammered, her usual bravado completely evaporating. "Close the door and sit down," I repeated, my voice firmer this time. "Unless you prefer this conversation to be public." That motivated her to move. She shut the door with trembling hands and slowly walked toward the chair, as if she were walking to her own execution. "I don't understand," she finally muttered, finding her voice. "How is it possible that you are the owner of your building?" I finished her question. "It's quite simple, Ashley. It turns out that the extra mouth to feed that bothered you so much had far more resources than you or Marcus ever imagined." She slumped into the chair, the color entirely drained from her face. Patricia, professional as ever, remained silent, but attentive. "When you kicked me out of my own home," I continued, "you told me it wasn't my house anymore, that it was yours and Marcus's. You were right. It was no longer my house. But as it turns out, now I control yours." Ashley opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly struggling to find words. Finally, she managed to speak. This can't be legal." "You can't." "I can't what?" I cut her off. "I can't be a successful businesswoman? I can't invest my money as I see fit? I assure you, everything I have done is completely legal." Patricia intervened, handing Ashley a folder. "These are all the documents supporting the rent increase. As you can see, it is based on professional assessments of the current market." Ashley skimmed the papers with shaky hands, but it was obvious she wasn't really reading them. Her mind was in full panic mode. "The increase is $1,400 a month," I said, watching her reaction. "That brings your rent to $4,200, which is the exact market rate for an apartment of your size and location." "It's impossible!" Ashley yelled, her composure finally shattering completely. "We can't afford that, you know we can't." "Oh?" I said, leaning forward. "So now $1,400 a month is too much money. How interesting. Do you know how much I spent on Marcus and you during the 2 years you lived in my house? How much I paid in utilities, groceries, repairs, and all those little favors you constantly demanded?" Ashley glared at me with pure hatred. That was different. You were his mother. I was his mother, I repeated slowly. And according to you, that made me a burden, an extra mouth to feed. Remember those exact words? I saw the precise moment she realized I had overheard that conversation. Her face turned even whiter. Do you know what I found out, Ashley? That while you were calling me a financial burden, you had cost Marcus over $40,000 in debt. He paid off your credit cards before the wedding, bought that ridiculously expensive ring, and now you have another $12,000 in brand new debt. That's not, she started to protest. That's not true. I pulled out a folder of documents from Sarah. I have all the credit reports right here. I also know about the brand new BMW, the expensive vacations, and the fact that Marcus had to take a second job just to maintain your lifestyle. Ashley sank further into her chair, tears beginning to pool in her eyes. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration, of sheer anger at having been found out. What do you want? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. I want you to experience exactly what you made me feel, I replied. I want you to know what it feels like to be considered a nuisance, a burden, something to be discarded. You can't do this, Ashley cried, her voice turning hysterical. You're family. You can't just throw us out like this. The hypocrisy of her words hit me like a slap. Family? Now I'm family. How convenient. When you kicked me out of my home, you made it very clear that I was no longer part of your family. Patricia cleared her throat discreetly. Would you like me to give you two some privacy to discuss this? No, I said firmly. This is a business meeting, not a family gathering. Ashley, you have 30 days to decide whether you can pay the new rent or if you need to find another place to live. This is revenge, Ashley yelled, standing up abruptly. This is completely about revenge. No, I replied calmly. This is justice, and for the first time in my life, I am the one holding the cards. Ashley stared at me with a mix of hatred and sheer desperation. Marcus won't allow this. He's going to. He's going to what? I interrupted. Protect you? Like he protected me when you threw me out? Marcus made his choice, Ashley. He chose a woman who is driving him into financial ruin over the mother who sacrificed everything for him. Ashley grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, but stopped just before walking out. This isn't over, she said with a trembling voice. You're right, I replied. It's not over until you've returned every ounce of respect and dignity you stole from me, and something tells me that's going to take a very long time. The door slammed shut behind her. Patricia and I sat in silence for a moment. That was intense, Patricia finally said. It's been a long time coming, I replied. Do you think she'll try anything legally? Patricia shook her head. Everything we have done is thoroughly documented and strictly legal. If she consults an attorney, they will tell her exactly that. That evening, Sarah called me with an update. Ashley called Marcus at work, completely hysterical. According to my sources, he had to leave early to go home and calm her down. Apparently, she's insisting that this has to be illegal somehow, and Marcus, according to my contact, Marcus is in shock. Apparently, he had no idea you had significant financial resources. He's questioning a lot of the decisions he's made over the last few months. Too late for questioning, I thought. The choices had been made, and the consequences were already in motion. That night, as I got ready for bed in my new apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Absolute contentment. It wasn't just about the money or the power, it was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about proving that Evelyn was not the victim they had believed her to be. 30 days. That was all the time they had left to figure out their next move. Something told me it was going to be a very long 30 days for them. The month that followed my meeting with Ashley was a fascinating blend of drama, desperation, and finally, acceptance of reality. Sarah kept me informed of every development, every frantic phone call, every desperate attempt to find a solution to their dilemma. Marcus had tried to contact me directly 3 times. The first time was through Patricia at the property management office. He told her it was urgent that he speak with me, that there were family misunderstandings we needed to resolve. Patricia, following my exact instructions, explained that all matters regarding the property had to be handled through the proper channels. The second time, he showed up at my first apartment building, asking for me at the front desk. The doorman, who had no idea who he was, simply told him he couldn't give out information about the residents. Marcus stood there for an hour hoping I would walk by, but I was out of town that day, meeting with other potential real estate investors. The third time was the most pathetic. Sarah informed me that Marcus had reached out to several distant relatives, trying to get my phone number or address. None of them had my current info, and most asked him why he couldn't just call me directly if he was my son. Apparently, Marcus didn't have a good answer for that. Ashley, for her part, had consulted with 2 different attorneys. Both told her exactly what Patricia had predicted. The rent increase was entirely legal, and she had no grounds for a lawsuit. One of the lawyers, according to Sarah, had straight up asked her if there was any personal conflict of interest with the landlord motivating her push for legal action. Ashley apparently hadn't mentioned our familial relationship. As the days ticked by, their options dwindled. Sarah reported that they had visited dozens of apartments, but all the ones they could afford were in much less desirable parts of the city, far away from Marcus's job. The few places in good locations had rents similar to the new price I had set. On day 20, Patricia called me with interesting news. "Mrs. Evelyn, we've received a payment offer for Unit 2B. They are asking for a payment plan for the rent increase, promising to pay $3,500 a month now, and the rest gradually over the next 6 months." "Who made the offer?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Mr. Marcus came in personally this morning without his wife. He looked desperate." I rejected the offer immediately. It wasn't just about the money. It was the principle. They hadn't been willing to make any concessions when they threw me out of my own home. Why should I show them a flexibility they never showed me? On day 25, Sarah informed me of a crisis in their relationship. According to my sources, Marcus and Ashley have been arguing non-stop. He's blaming her for the whole situation, saying that if she hadn't insisted on kicking you out, you would still be helping them financially. She is furious. She's calling him a weak man who can't solve his own problems. The irony was perfect. Financial pressure was revealing the true nature of their relationship. Without me there as their common scapegoat, they were now turning on each other. On day 29, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Mrs. Henderson, my old neighbor. "Evelyn, dear," her familiar voice sounded. "I need to tell you something. Marcus came to see me yesterday, asking if I had any way to contact you." "And what did you tell him?" I asked, curious. I told him the truth, that I didn't have your contact info. But Evelyn, that boy looked terrible. Thin, bags under his eyes, like he hasn't slept in weeks. He asked me if I knew why you had left so suddenly. That piece of information surprised me. "Did you tell him I was kicked out?" "I told him I saw when they packed your things and put you in a taxi. I asked him if something had happened, and he got very uncomfortable. He changed the subject real quick." So, Marcus had lied to the neighbors about my departure. He probably told them I moved out voluntarily to keep up appearances. "Is there anything else?" Mrs. Henderson continued. "I've noticed a lot of issues at that house since you left. Loud arguments, music blaring at strange hours, and yesterday I saw Ashley screaming at Marcus in the front yard. It was quite embarrassing." Day 30 arrived without any communication from Marcus or Ashley. Patricia confirmed that they had neither paid the new rent nor given notice that they were moving out. "Technically," Patricia explained, "they are now in violation of their lease. We can begin the eviction process immediately." "Proceed," I told her. "But use all the proper legal channels. I want everything to be flawless from a legal standpoint." 3 days later, Marcus and Ashley received the official eviction notice. They had 72 hours to vacate the unit or face legal action. That evening, Sarah called me with the final update. "They are moving out," she informed me. "There's a moving truck in front of the building right now." According to my sources, they found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, almost an hour away from Marcus's work. From my apartment window, which had a perfect view of the Maple Gardens building, I could see the moving truck. It was small, much smaller than the one they had needed when they kicked me out of my house. Apparently, they had been forced to sell a lot of their belongings. I watched Marcus carrying boxes, his movements slow and defeated. Ashley stood off to the side on her phone, likely complaining to someone about her situation. Even from a distance, I could see the severe tension in her body language. 2 hours later, the truck drove away. The apartment that had been their home for 2 years was now empty. The next day, Patricia and I inspected the unit. It was in excellent condition, which didn't surprise me. Marcus had always been careful with material things, a trait he had learned from me during his childhood. "I have 3 applications for this unit," Patricia informed me. "One is from a young couple who are both teachers. Great references. They are willing to pay full asking price immediately." "Perfect," I replied. "Schedule the interviews." A week later, the apartment had new tenants. David and Mary Roberts, both elementary school teachers in their 30s. They were exactly the kind of tenants I wanted: responsible, stable, and respectful. While signing the lease, Mary commented, "This building has such good energy. The apartment really feels like a home." She was right. Without Marcus and Ashley's toxicity, the entire building felt lighter, more positive. 6 months later, my life had completely transformed. I had expanded my real estate portfolio by purchasing 2 more buildings. The income from my properties provided me with a very comfortable life, and more importantly, complete independence. Sarah kept me updated on Marcus and Ashley occasionally, though I no longer hired her regularly for that. They had managed to stabilize financially, but barely. Marcus was working both of his jobs, and Ashley had finally gotten a job as a receptionist at a dental clinic. They lived in a no-frills, 1-bedroom apartment, completely stripped of the extravagant lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. The most interesting part was that their marriage had apparently survived, but it had fundamentally changed. Without extra money to spend on expensive entertainment, without the comfort of a big house, they were forced to face the reality of who they truly were as a couple. According to Sarah, they didn't look nearly as happy as before. 1 year after the day I was kicked out of my home, I was sitting on the terrace of my new, larger, and much more elegant apartment, enjoying my morning coffee and reading the financial paper. My investments had been highly successful, and I was looking into expanding into commercial real estate. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered it anyway. Evelyn. The voice belonged to Marcus, but it sounded different, older, more tired. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year. "Hello, Marcus. I needed to call you. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about the choices I made." I waited, saying nothing. "I wanted to apologize," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I was wrong. Ashley was wrong. What we did to you was unforgivable." "Why are you calling me now, Marcus?" I asked, my voice completely neutral. "Because I finally understand what I lost. I didn't just lose my mother. I lost the only person who truly loved me unconditionally." The words stung, but they no longer held the power to break me like they would have a year ago. "Marcus," I said calmly, "I spent 62 years loving you unconditionally. I gave you everything I had. And when I was no longer convenient for your life, you tossed me out like garbage. That was your choice." "I know," he murmured. "Is there any way that I can fix this?" I thought about his question for a long moment. Part of me, the part that would always be his mother, wanted to say yes. But the woman who had learned to value herself, the woman who had built a new life founded on self-respect, knew the answer was different. "Marcus," I said finally, "you made your choice when you held all the cards. Now I hold mine, and my choice is to live a life where nobody treats me like I'm disposable." Silence hung on the other end of the line. "If one day you truly understand the damage you caused, if you genuinely change as a person, maybe we can talk. But it's not going to be today. And it's not going to be just because your life is hard right now." I hung up the phone and went back to my coffee. From my terrace, I could see the entire city stretching out before me. It was a beautiful view, one I had earned with my own determination and intelligence. For the first time in my life, I was completely free. Free from toxic expectations, free from draining relationships, free from being the person who always gave but never received. At 63 years old, I had learned the most valuable lesson of my life, that self-love is not selfishness, it is survival. And that sometimes, the best revenge isn't hurting those who hurt you, but living so well that they can no longer touch you. Marcus and Ashley had gotten exactly what they deserved, a life without the woman they had considered a burden, but who had actually been their salvation, and I had gotten something even better, a life without them.